Guys, welcome to week 5. So that's April 20th to April 24th. Here is your update for the week. It's a little shorter than last week, which is good because I know last week was pretty long with all the Cold War stuff. So yeah, we'll just go through a few different things. So first off, I know that some of you, your grades changed a bit. Now, unfortunately, some of them they're going to shift back. So we had originally looked at categorizing our grades so that we'd have like in classwork, so what we actually completed in class, and then remote learning is a separate category. But after doing some research, we realized that it would have more equality in our grades over the long run if we stuck with total points. So everything will still be labeled as remote learning. But some of your grades will change back, okay? It'll all even out in the end as long as you actually do the work expected of you with remote learning. But just keep that in mind. And I'm going to send an email to your parents explaining that as well. So I apologize for some of like the changes. For most of you, it hasn't made like a huge difference. But for some of you, you might have seen like some big jumps, okay? Now, I've been calling all students to have, with everybody who I've had zero contact with. So if you are one of those people, or if you know somebody who's one of those people, please let me know ASAP, okay? So the weekly updates. So for Iraq this week, there's just one video I want you to watch, and it's on how the U.S. failed to rebuild Afghanistan. It's a really interesting watch based on kind of what the U.S.'s mission when they first got to Afghanistan was after they kind of took initial control with the Taliban, and then a lot of what they basically plan to do to try and make the country better, and kind of what failed and things like that. We'll go through the PowerPoint here. There's some textbooks pages that I want you to read. You don't have to read the entire chapter, so make sure you just read those specific sections. And then I'm going to also put out the assignment to essay prep. So you got that in class before we left or before classes got canceled, but I'm going to post it again digitally for you guys. Just so you have, because next week we're having an assignment to essay. We will have a webinar on Wednesday at 1 p.m. And the Chapter 9 activity book I've posted in the classwork section of your Google Classroom. And then the assignment that you have this week is on how did the United States fail in Afghanistan, okay? So you need to have watched the video, read the textbook, and then done that section in your activity book before you can kind of answer the questions that are on the Google Docs. So just keep that in mind. And then by the end of this week, you should know how liberalism was imposed on Indigenous people, and then why liberalism gets imposed, okay? So I'll go through the PowerPoint and go through some key points. I did cancel some slides in the PowerPoint from like the older one. I don't think I ever posted this one, but just so you're aware, okay? Okay, so key terms, this is in your activity book as well as at the beginning of the textbook, so please make sure you know these ones. Okay, so just as women, unpropertied men, and enslaved people all fell outside the range of a lot of classical liberals, so did Indigenous people. And so, like when I say we, but when the colonizers first came to Canada, you have to keep in mind that it was a very beneficial relationship for both of them to work together. But as time went on and as the colonizers got more and more comfortable, it was kind of established by these liberal thinkers that, the Indigenous people should give up what they know and then adopt liberalism. And this was done through assimilation. Okay. Now, this is also happening today because as more Western democracies try to spread liberalism around the world, they also believe that those people have to kind of they have to assimilate to what like the United States or Canada or Great Britain kind of want in order to make things work. Now we've talked about I never say this right, but the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So this was actually very unique because when the colonizers came over to Canada, they were like, wow, this is really different. It's like, it's not what we have back in Great Britain where they had like a monarchy and like basically a dictatorship. And so it actually became a fairly dominant force. The writers of the US Constitution actually used part of the Confederacy in the US Constitution. So it did have a lot of influence on early leaders. However, as it went on, there was more and more contrasting ideas, and it led to a lot of misunderstanding, especially in terms of land ownership, which we still see today. This is just a good reading talking about the concept of land ownership. So, one of our elders from Hobbema says, when the Europeans first came, the people who spoke on the elders' behalf told them, "You see that mountain over there? That's not ours to give you. The land we cannot give you because it's not ours to give. It belongs to the Creator. Those trees and the animals we cannot give you. They're not ours to give. But this is what we'll do. That mountain, that rock represents our faith, and we will treat you in good faith. The animals represent our sharing and our kindness, and we will treat you with kindness." So the concept of land ownership really made a huge difference in that early relationship between Indigenous people and the colonizers, because to First Nations people, to Indigenous people, land ownership was not a thing. You didn't own the land, you couldn't own the air, you couldn't own the water. But for Europeans, it was like, well, no, this is our written land claim, you know? So other attempts to assimilate Indigenous people in society, there was two main ways. One, through residential schools, which basically was forced indoctrination on young Indigenous people. And then second, enfranchisement. So enfranchisement is when you give non-Indigenous rights to First Nations men to basically entice them, and only men, to entice them to give up their Indian status. And we're going to talk about that in a second. So enfranchisement, the Gradual Civilization Act was passed in 1857. And so basically what happened is that if you were a First Nation man, only man, who gave up your official Indian status, you'd be given 50 acres of land, you would get a share of treaty settlements, and some band money. Now, only one person ever actually was enfranchised this way, and Aboriginals in Canada protested against this. Now, the Indian Act was passed in 1876. Now, keep in mind that the only time you should ever be using the term Indian is if it's in reference to a government document. Otherwise, it always needs to be Aboriginal or Indigenous, First Nations, things like that. Indian is not a correct term to be used because they're not from India. Unfortunately, government documents have it called Indian, and so that's why the Indian Act, or like Indian status, things like that, that's kind of where it makes the difference. Now, the Indian Act separated the First Nations people from the rest of Canada, and they used it to control their behavior. So it basically forced them onto reserves, but in many cases, the land that they were given was not land that they had traditionally been on, and so they didn't know how to use the land properly. It destroyed First Nation culture, traditions, customs, because they basically forced them to follow certain laws if they had the Indian Act. So then it basically encouraged them to abandon that Indian status and then become like a full-fledged member of Canada. Okay, assimilation. Land claims, like I said, was a big one. So there was two main concerns, because a lot of the treaty land that was given to Indigenous people wasn't actually protected by the Canadian government a lot of the time. So in 1982, the Constitution Act recognized and affirmed these treaty rights. And so for the first time ever in 1982, the collective rights of Indigenous people of Canada actually entered into laws of Canada. Now, there are two things that kind of went over commissions on Aboriginal people. So one was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. Now, for the most part, it really failed. It was supposed to have Aboriginal self-government and address all of these needs, and it didn't. The second one was the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. So this was created in 1998 as a result of the Royal Commission. And in many cases, it did provide a lot of settlements. $406 million of financial settlements and grants were given out. And then the last thing of the chapter is looking at basically enforced liberalism on the rest of the world. So there are two big reasons why countries do this. One is self-interest, so protecting ourselves. How can we protect ourselves against a terrorist or against someone who doesn't feel the same way as us? And second is humanitarian. And so a lot of times countries will say, well, we're imposing liberalism because it's the right thing to do. We need to give them democracy. We need to stop human rights violations, which is a good thing. Things like that. So we're very familiar with imposing it for self-interest. The United States, when you look at like Woodrow Wilson wanted to do it after the Treaty of Versailles. So this is familiar when you see like the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq and the Cold War and things like that. If you embrace liberalism, you are less likely to threaten the security of other liberal nations. And so it is in the benefit of liberal nations to have more liberal nations. Now, one of the things we're going to do this week is talk about Canada and Afghanistan and the United States and Afghanistan. So after 9/11, the United States invaded Afghanistan, and Canada, as an ally, also did so. Now, should we have been involved? Were we helping the Afghan people? Were we doing it for humanitarian reasons? Were we doing it for self-interest? Or was it just to protect ourselves? Like you kind of have to think about like what was really the whole point of this. Was it because it's the right thing to do? Or is it because we didn't want to be attacked ourselves? Okay. And then also, should we impose democracy on others? And if so, when? When does it make sense to impose democracy? Will democracy always come to you? And does it come in the way of war and things like that? Okay. So, what you're going to do this week, you're going to watch this video on how the US failed to rebuild Afghanistan. So, like I said, it's really interesting, and it kind of talks about like what the whole point was of going in, what they wanted to do, and then what they actually did. Because 2 years into the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq started, and then a lot of stuff that got started in Afghanistan just completely failed and didn't keep going, and it created more problems. And then you're going to do this Google Doc. So like I said, you have to watch that video, and you had to have read a section in your textbook. And this is listed in the Google Doc as well. But you need to look at like what are attempts to impose liberalism. And then there's 4 questions, okay? It might look like there's only 3 because there's a cartoon in the third one, but there's a 4th one underneath. So make sure you watch or you read that, okay? Like I said, we'll have a webinar on that should be April 22nd. My apologies. And then next week, we are having a take-home essay response for assignment number 2. This is your only assignment all week. I'll hand it out on Monday. It'll be due on Friday, and you just need to complete that. I'll post the digital version of planning for assignment 2 if you don't have it anymore. And if there's anything else you guys need, please let me know. You can email me. You can message me on Teams. You guys are getting better at using Teams, which is awesome. And yeah, you can email me or message me in the Google Classroom, and it'll pop up in my inbox for apparently everybody but Kira. I don't know why Kira's goes to my junk mail, but sorry, Kira. Everybody else's goes to my inbox. So that's it. And I miss you guys, and I'll see you on Wednesday. And yeah, please stay healthy and please stay well. Bye, guys.